Like,
Sir. Good morning. I am Dr. Zothansangi, Assistant Professor in the Department of Zoology, Government Sampaio College. Today, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you on the final day of international webinar organized by Government Sampaio College with the theme Natural Disaster with special emphasis on earthquake and its implications. First of all, I would like to remind the participants that the feedback link of today's session will be available during the second session and will be pinned in the comment section below. Only to those who submitted this feedback form will be sent their certificate of participations. And also for any questions and queries, you may pin them down in the comment section below. Moving on to the technical session for today, we are very fortunate to have two eminent speakers from the United Nations, and I'm very proud to introduce the first speaker, a lady with numbers of experiences in working with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, at national and international levels. She has been working with UNDP for 13 years, where she supports different countries of Asia Pacific to strengthen their capacities in coping with their climate change impacts. At present, she is involved in the development of large-scale project proposal in climate change adaptation in Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Nepal, and Philippines. And also she supports implementation of climate change adaptation project in Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Laos, Myanmar, and other South Asian countries. In India, she used to be the program officer with UNDP, handling natural resource management and biodiversity portfolio. She has been instrumental in mobilizing to support the poor and marginalized communities in different parts of the country, and also done assignments with World Bank on natural resource management and livelihoods in Northeast India. As a senior reporter in Down to Earth, which is a fortnightly journal of science and environment, she covered a number of issues on environmental and development in different parts of the country. Today, she is presenting us a topic, United Nations Organization, UNO, Intervention on Natural Disaster. With this, I welcome the Regional Technical Advisor, Climate Change and Adaptation, Asia Pacific with UNDP, Bangkok, Thailand, Mrs. Lianchawii on screen.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here in front of a well-learned audience. You have touched, the speakers before me have touched a lot of technical issues in the past few days, all very interesting and well-covered areas related to earthquakes. But today being the last day, it will be a little lighter and we'll move away the focus from all these technical issues that have been well covered in earlier presentations and shifting more to issues related to social and development dimensions of natural disasters. So one thing I'd like to point out is that my presentation today is broad because UN's presence globally is wide. It's present in almost 193, 95 countries. So it's not possible to cover all that UNDP or UN does in these countries. So I'll be narrowing it down to just a bit of work on natural disasters specifically, and also on climate change, given that I have been working on climate change issues. And I will be sharing a bit of experiences in these countries, and hopefully the audience will be able to learn something from these experiences in these different countries. So without much ado, let me start the presentation. Mm. Okay. So, as I've said, it's since UN organization itself has in India alone, we are present. I think there are more than 20, almost 30 UN organizations in the country. So it's difficult to know what each organization is doing. So, for me in this presentation, I will be focusing more on UNDP's work because that is where I work, and I know a little bit more on UNDP's work than other UN organizations, but also I will touch a little bit on some joint interventions that UN organizations have had. So here is my presentation. So we'll start now. So to give it a bit of a background, like how I said, my focus is on climate and also on natural disasters. And since I am not an expert on earthquakes, I will be touching upon disasters in general, be it earthquakes or floods or cyclones, all that kind of work and disaster risk work that UNDP is doing in different parts of the world. So to start with climate-induced disasters, we all know that it is always the marginalized people, the vulnerable people, the poor people who are most affected when disaster strikes. So it will be the older women, the children, the disabled, and the elderly in general who are most affected because of their inability to cope easily with when it happens. So in the past 2 decades, there have been almost 80% of the disasters that have happened in the past 2 decades were all related to extreme weather events, climate-related events. And because of this, every year, 20 million people around the world are left destitute because of these disasters. And because of that, what also happens is that every country has this ambition to achieve certain sustainable development goals, but that receives a setback because of these events, which destroys livelihoods of many people. So according to a study by UN Environment Program, for these for countries, to developing countries especially, to adapt to climate change, they will require 140 to 300 billion by 2030, and that is the year of the Sustainable Development Goals, achievements. Sorry, I'm just moving. Yeah. Okay, so like how I said earlier, in the past decade itself, there were more than 1.5 billion people who have been affected by disasters, and these disasters cost at least, USD 1.3 trillion. And in these, in the past 2 decades, again, 1.3 million people have lost their lives to disasters just of the tsunami and earthquake. And if you look at what happened in Nepal in 2005, when an earthquake with a very high intensity hit, according to a study conducted after that, more than 750,000 people fell into the poverty line after they've come out of it. Now, again, affecting countries' ambitions to, towards sustainable development, towards economic development, that gets affected tremendously. I believe in India alone, in the past 1 decade, around 270 million people have moved out of the poverty line. But again, because of these disasters and also because of incidents like COVID outbreaks, it is likely that these people could fall back into poverty because of the loss of jobs, livelihoods, and that sort of a thing. So when you come to UNDP's work, we work in all over the world in more than 170 countries, and we do usually work in regions. So we are in Africa region, Arab states, Asia Pacific, Europe, Commonwealth and independent states, as well as Latin America. So where I am based is in the Asia Pacific office of UNDP in Bangkok. Now, when you come to the disaster, that was a bit of a background. Now, coming to the UNDP's work on disaster risk reduction, it is guided by the principles of Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. And over the, $1 billion have been spent by UNDP on disaster-related recovery, technical, financial assistance for post-disaster, as you can see, in 112 countries. And these are on a range of support. One is related to risk information, gathering information related to risks and informing government policies based on these information. Then we also have the support to countries on governance, on disaster and climate risk governance. Then, of course, we're working on preparedness and early warning systems, so that the people who are, in the last mile are connected through this. Then we're supporting risk management of governments and cities. Then post-disaster as needs assessment, which UNDP does a lot, and also on disaster recovery so that people can build back better. So moving to the next slide. So before I go to the next slide, I would just like to sort of categorize it the way UNDP generally does on these, on the risks. They sort of categorize it into communicating risk, one, and then one would be on managing risks, and then reducing risks, and then managing risks. So communicating risks, reducing risks, and managing risks. So what do we mean by communicating risk? Basically, it's getting as much information as possible on risks, on damages, loss and damages, gather that information and use that information to make decisions. So here what I've done in these bullets is taken examples from different countries and what has been done in these countries. I have not specified the countries, but I have just pulled out examples of what we have done under this communicating risks. We have done risk assessment and developed national seismic hazard maps. We've done integration of seismic risk reduction into planning and business processes, national disaster damage and loss database in some countries. In some countries have done national flood hazard and risk maps. Some countries have done national risk profile of risks to national infrastructure. So they have listed the important infrastructures in the countries and the level of risks and assessment of risks in these infrastructure. So further to that, under communicating risk, also we have these early warning systems, which you all are probably aware of. It is useful because it helps to prepare and prevent before hazard strikes. But this may not be relevant in the context of earthquakes, but it could be in other natural disaster situations like floods, especially cyclones, all that. And it helps to reduce loss of lives and livelihoods. So again, these bullet points are examples from countries where early warning systems have been used. In some countries, they're using mobile apps where communities have access to those apps, and millions of cell phone users they can directly access those apps, and they get warned when a big cyclone is going to hit, typhoons are going to hit, or if there is a potential landslide. They are informed about those disasters so that people can prepare in advance, and they can save lives, and then also crop losses as well. So these early warning systems are useful to, monitor even climate change risks through, they upgrade them to include the climate angle into the warning systems. And then they can also, they have a role in improving forest management as well, amongst many other things. Now moving on to reducing risks. This is more to support, institutional strengthening and supporting establishing legal framework by, working with different institutions or working with government, mainly through capacity building of maybe government officials, staff, people working in in risk or natural disaster areas. So working very closely with these to build their capacities and train them. So again, these are the examples that I've listed below that we've done in some countries. We've integrated disaster risk reduction into annual development budgets of some countries. And in others, we've looked at building capacities of the staff working in disaster offices, strengthening coordination between disaster offices and relevant other offices, and also, setting up multi-stakeholder disaster management committees. In Mizoram also, I think we have these as well. And then, of course, risk reduction initiatives in schools, firefighting, on infrastructure. All these are the examples that I have gathered from different countries. And further, on reducing risks, again, we have mainstreaming DRR into development. What do we mean by that? We're talking about risk reduction into government's policies, plans, budgets. It could be at different levels. It can be national level, or it could be even at the district levels. How can disaster risk reduction be integrated? Not just having disaster risk reduction separately in the disaster department's work, but also having them in, let's say, planning department's work. The planning department integrates that into their strategies if a country is or a region is vulnerable to disasters. So we have looked in some countries at integrating DRR into climate change policies, into community development plans. And in some places we've prepared district disaster management plans or village disaster management plans with the communities, communities being actively involved in preparing these plans. And in some, we have supported building guides and codes to incorporate disaster risk. And also we've integrated seismic reduction risk assessment into land use plans as well. And now moving on to managing risks. What is UNDP's work in this? One would be on preparedness. How do you prepare for disaster? Again, it's difficult in the context of earthquakes, but of course, to a large extent, you can also apply some of these experiences as well. So we do risk assessment, and based on the risk assessment, we do contingency planning. We have to do stockpiling, storing supplies if needed to prepare for disaster, and assigning groups and people their roles and responsibilities, coordinating with different departments, NGOs, CSOs, all that. And then also looking at arrangements for financing recovery. So what are the examples from countries that I've put here? Communities have been trained in first aid, search and rescue, safe evacuation practices. And then they've been trained in handling emergency response equipment, in handling those, and then understanding warning alerts. Cyclone shelters have been built. We've done a lot of that in Bangladesh, especially. And it's not just for the people, but also for their livestock, these cyclone shelters. And then we emphasize the importance of forest cover in mitigating natural disasters, such as landslides or flash floods. And we've done forest restoration, terracing. This is something also relevant for terrains like we have in Mizoram. Stone walls, reservoirs, slope stabilization, water harvesting, soil conservation. These are the few examples that I've come up with. And then on managing risks, how do we look at management of risks? One is what UNDP does is on post-disaster needs assessment. So here it looks at the different sectoral needs. We not just one sector, looking at cross sectors, agriculture, environment, livestock, the natural resources, all these departments, and seeing what are assessing these sectors, what are the needs, and also not just the sectors, also the people, the social dimension. What do the disabled, what kind of support do the disabled people require that is different from what the youth or children require? So that kind of assessment is done. And then also in some countries, the training has been provided to national and district officials on how to prepare these post-disaster needs assessment and the vulnerability as well as hazard and risk mapping. Further, there is, again, on managing risk, we're looking at recovery. How do we assist affected communities to recover from the effects of disaster? I'll show a small example case study later, but here again are some of what UNDP does. We support in immediate, livelihoods, supporting communities with livelihoods, and then bringing back, small businesses. It could be in farming, fishing, just to strengthen the resilience of the affected communities. And then we've helped in building earthquake-resistant houses for earthquake victims. And then this is post-recovery. So, and then also strengthening the emergency response and coordination centers. So this is one example of UNDP support on the Nepal earthquake in 2015. As you all know, I don't recall what the magnitude was. You all probably know better. So what we have done was, initially, the immediate response was to look at debris removal, emergency, livelihoods, recovery, coordination. All that was done immediately. And then, of course, we helped the government in assessing the needs of the people through post-disaster needs assessment. And then we also co-led with other agencies the early recovery under the leadership of the government of Nepal. And then we had the local governance system in restoring, justice, the political, legal aid, or to ensure affected communities, have access to these systems and services. And we had the National Reconstruction Authority to develop policies and implementation on reconstruction policy for the country. And also, of course, focusing on long-term recovery with emphasis on resilience, and also looking at renewable energy alternatives for the affected communities in the most vulnerable and remote areas of the country. And now these are just the highlights we helped in, like how I said, the debris removal, a lot of which was also again reused in construction, and emergency employment with the focus on women. Half of these people who were helped were women, and we have damaged small businesses rebuilt, and small solar power systems in places where the electricity was completely out, helped entrepreneurs again with psychosocial counseling, trained engineers and masons in earthquake safe houses construction. And then, of course, as you can see, these are all the other things that we have supported in 50,000 affected people in mobile human rights clinics. And another interesting aspect of it is also in helping the government in development, what is called the electronic building permit system in 2 cities in Kathmandu Valley, so what happens is also that we have supported the banks, advocated with them, banks and also other financial institutions, to invest in construction that complies with building codes, the safe building codes. And now banks no longer provide loans to buyers who have whose houses have not been retrofitted. And so we've also helped the government in developing retrofitting guidelines into the building codes. And like how I said, masons were trained in earthquake resilient construction techniques, and of course local bodies such as the municipalities, village committees, they were trained to enforce safe building standards as well. And that was the UNDP intervention in Nepal. And now just a small quick case study in Albania, where there was a joint UN recovery initiative. Here, it's not UNDP alone. It's, as you can see, a multiple number of UN agencies that work together. And each agency was given definite role, and not just roles, but they also helped in mobilizing money, resources to help the Albanian government to recover from the disaster. So in these, what was done was by different agencies, UNDP and World Bank, they supported the post-disaster needs assessment. And based on that, they also helped in developing the building damage assessment tool and methodology, which is now used by the government. So based on the post-disaster needs assessment, these other agencies, UN agencies, also made their intervention. WHO on health, of course, focusing on health sector recovery and continuity of and running of hospitals, making them operational after the disaster, and UNICEF on maternal child health care, as well as also on the education sector. IOM and UNOPS were supporting the recovery in the housing sector, UNESCO on the cultural heritage side, FAO in agriculture, and UN Women across all these to try and see how gender can be mainstreamed in post-disaster recovery, and working with all these UN agencies on this. Okay, that is the bit about the disaster initiative, natural disaster risk reduction by UNDP. And now moving a little bit, the focus a little bit on climate change adaptation. Here again, since we are doing a lot in many countries, I am only going to do a light touch of what we do, because it's difficult to single out one country and talk about what we're doing in one country from the regional offices level. So climate change adaptation, as you can see from this presentation, we have now, it was 89 earlier, now it's almost 100 projects. And we have secured $1.2 billion from different donors, through 130 projects all around the world. As you can see in this in the map, these are the areas where we are working, and this is just a snapshot of what UNDP does on climate change adaptation. So within this adaptation area itself, we have different cross-cutting and focal areas. One is on livelihoods, and the other is on food security, focusing on water resources and coastal management, and the other one is on ecosystem-based adaptation. So a little bit of, and of course the cross-cutting part would be the disaster risk reduction, which is definitely one that cross-cuts all these. In all these projects that the four cross-cutting areas that I'm talking, thematic areas I'm talking about, we focus on gender, we focus on enterprise development, and of course on disaster risk reduction in all these themes. On livelihoods, these are the areas that UNDP works on. We have currently around 640 million secured, and around 66 projects in different parts of the country, which are identified in this pink color in these maps. Well, the PowerPoint says it all. 80 million people are benefiting from these interventions, and there are different innovative financing mechanisms that have been established in these countries. And the main areas of work is largely to support, small entrepreneurs, small, medium enterprises, of course, with an emphasis on women, and livelihood diversification, because the focus of UNDP here is to build resilience, climate change resilience of communities through resilient livelihoods. So these are the interventions that we have: crop diversification, regenerative agriculture, quality and certification standards, value addition of agriculture products, etc. And then next, we also work in the area of food security. And as you can see, these are the areas that we work in. Some 850 hectares of agricultural land are under improved management to help, these small, mainly small farmer communities to smallholder farmers with land holding of just 1 hectare or one, maybe maximum of 2 hectares, to be able to have practice resilient agriculture, climate resilient or climate smart agriculture, as you call it. We are supporting these communities, these farmers in different parts of the world. And these are the main areas of focus. Sustainable land management, as I said, climate resilient agriculture, promoting intercropping, supporting resilient seeds and crop varieties, etc. And then on ecosystem-based adaptation, we are working across in many, many countries, including, as you can see, India, where we have a lot of work as well, worth $500 million from different donors. And currently we have almost 50 projects in these countries, mainly supporting restoration and protection of ecosystems. In these countries, forest ecosystems and biodiversity, coastal resilience, mangroves, forest, agricultural land, all these are covered under this portfolio. And as you can see, we help in reforestation of land as well, and protecting protected areas. And then another area of focus of UNDP is on climate resilient water and coastal water resources and coastal management. We do a lot of work in the Pacific countries, especially because Pacific countries are and small island countries are prone to climate-induced disasters. They are more vulnerable. So these are communities that are receiving a lot of support. And of course, as you can see from this, we're supporting 16,000 kilometers of coastline all around the world. And as I said, specifically in the Pacific and small island developing nations. And these are the areas of work: helping restore mangroves or seawalls, and helping build capacities, developing water management plans. These are just some of the highlights of the work that we do. And apart from supporting communities in rural areas who are dependent on natural resources, we also work on urban resilience as well. So helping, again, government, communities in building resilient infrastructure, climate smart urban resilient infrastructure. So these are the main areas of work, again: risk-informed urban planning and budgeting, climate resilient urban services. So it's difficult for me to get into details into any of these. And like how I said, disaster risk reduction is cross-cutting in all these areas of work. And another aspect of this is climate information and early warning systems, which I touched upon a little bit earlier. Where we have installed early warning systems in many countries, almost 300 of them. And then this has benefited people who are risk prone and prone to disasters. It could be floods, tsunamis, cyclones, all that as well. So we help in modeling and forecasting, helping communities, helping institutional strengthening for modeling and forecasting. And also we support value chain development, helping communities set up businesses, enterprises, farmers setting up their enterprises, helping in financial literacy so that they can start their own businesses, those areas as well, to make them more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So in a gist, that is all that I can cover now. It is much more than what I planned to, the time that I thought I would take. It's almost I think, around 40 minutes now. And thank you for your patience and thank you for listening in.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lianchawii, for the informative and perspicuous presentation. And I hope that the presentation was immensely beneficial for all the participants and viewers. A warm welcome back to all the participants and viewers. We have come to the second session of the day and also the last presentation for this one-week international webinar organized by Government Samphai College on natural disaster with special emphasis on earthquake and its implications. Once again, I would like to remind the participants that the feedback link will be for today's session will be available during this presentation, which will be pinned in the comment section below, as this will be taken as your attendance. And also for any queries and questions, you may drop them down in the comment section below. Moving on to the technical session, with immense pleasure, I would like to introduce the resource person, Mr. Sudarshan Rodriguez, who is a development professional with 22 years of experience with variety of organizations like the United Nations, um, grassroots organizations, policy think tanks, civil society, and academia. He has a multidisciplinary background in disaster management, environmental sciences, environmental economics, policy, and environmental law. Till March 2020, he worked as program director at Mahatma Gandhi Academy of Human Development at a center of Tata Institute and of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Starting his career in 1998 with UNDP India as a program development specialist on their environment program, he was since then worked in several locations on interdisciplinary aspects of natural resources and environmental management. He has worked in the area of disaster response and management in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and the Andamans on the tsunami disaster relief and rehabilitation, and has also served on multidisciplinary teams for assessment and evaluation of tsunami disaster rehabilitation. He was also an advisor to the Japan Foundation of Disaster and Sustainable Education Fellowship and worked with Asian countries, mentoring fellows on hands-on disaster management. With his vast area of expertise on natural disaster management and rehabilitation, may I invite Mr. Sudarshan Rodriguez to kindly start his presentation on social dimension for earthquake and disaster management.
Thank you. At first, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this platform to speak and share my experience and what has worked for me. I must first state that I am not an academic, and I don't do research projects. I am involved in training and capacity building, as well as intervention in disaster management. And I also teach based on that experience. So I added one more element in my presentations, which is basically what are the social and environment and development dimensions in disaster management. And I will run through that with you in this presentation. So these are the words I'm sure you've heard over the past few days in different sessions, whether it's risk, hazards, community, preparedness, risk reduction. So my first thing is, does anyone know what this is? And let me illustrate below. This is the 100-fold decrease in deaths due to cyclone of the same intensity. And this is from the World Disaster Report 2016. So from the 1970s, with the same intensity cyclone, we had deaths up to 5 lakh. And in 2007, it's for the same intensity cyclone, we have only 4,000 deaths. I mean, no death is, we should make it zero. But then it's a 100-fold decrease. So what has changed? One is government's capacity and development. And the second is communities' preparedness and their ability to deal with disasters. And that's what resilience actually is. So I just gave this to this. And in fact, I'll go to my next slide. This is important to know, and especially in your region. These are years, deaths, and wind speed, and the severity index of cyclones. And it's from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is now known as a worldwide example of the ability to deal with disasters, something that many people do not know. Most people think it's Western countries or developed countries, but it is actually Bangladesh that has actually substantially reduced their ability to deal with disasters. And it's also Mizoram's neighbor, so it's important to know that you also can be a leader in this and learn from each other. So, what is a disaster and what is vulnerability? And vulnerability can be due to natural factors like landslides or the natural terrain, but vulnerability can also be social. So one of the members of the National Disaster Management Authority shared once on a platform that earthquakes don't kill people, it's buildings that actually kill people. And that's the difference between a hazard, and when a hazard cannot be handled, then it becomes a disaster. Because we as human beings, as government, as community, are not able to deal with that hazard. So what is vulnerability? So let me give you an example of social vulnerability. And in this particular thing, and it's a quiz, I thought there would be students and I could do a quiz, but generally in development sector, we find that women and children are more vulnerable to disasters. So in fact, the government has a database of all pregnant women and lactating women, and immediately during a disaster, like in the cyclones that hit Tamil Nadu or any district, this database goes to the district collector, and immediate interventions and top priority are given, such that in terms of provision, so it runs under a different scheme, but the vulnerable groups are identified. Yeah. Another issue that actually has an implication on vulnerability is capacity. Do the local people have capacity? And in this case, there are two villages, and we find the context of capacity at the local village, whether they're trained in first aid or not, makes a huge difference in their ability to respond. I want to stress here the word in both in the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, as well as in all disaster literature, first responders are no longer the people who come in from out. The first responders are considered people from within the village. And in Mizoram, for example, you have YMA that is present everywhere in every community, in every village. So first responders are from within the community and society, and communities themselves who are also survivors or victims of this disaster. This is an example of physical vulnerability. And it's important to realize it because I said it's about, and this is how development comes into place. So for urban development and how you plan a city, that can also increase or decrease vulnerability. So I've given you two cities here from, can anyone guess where this city is? And can you actually look at, if there was an earthquake, which city would be more vulnerable? I would say city 1 because it's more dense, and let's on city 2, and city 1 is Aizawl, and city 2 is Champai. So you can see the density and the population, and this is from the census population of 2011. So more urban cities in the context of floods or in terms of cyclones or in terms of earthquakes would be more vulnerable because just of its sheer density, given if the magnitude of the hazard, earthquake, flood, is the same. Yeah. Another dimension of social vulnerability is disruption of livelihood. So different people's livelihoods and income can be affected differently. For example, in an earthquake or a flood, a shop owner who might have his assets or his shop destroyed is more vulnerable than a government, a person working for the government who will have a steady income and will still be working. So the idea is here to illustrate my socioeconomic background has a determinant on how I will bounce back during a disaster. So I want you to look at these multiple frames because we have multiple ways of looking at vulnerability itself. So a disaster risk, basically, you have a hazard like an earthquake, and it can happen in any location. And you have two factors that actually determine what makes it a disaster or not, or rather what increases the risk or not. One is local capacity to deal, so local training, local preparedness. And second is vulnerability, socioeconomic, age, more, in fact, I forgot to mention earlier, it's elderly, women and children are more vulnerable in disasters. And that's a thumb rule of looking at demography when we want to understand the social dimensions of vulnerability and disaster management. So you realize that the more capacity I have, the less risk if the hazard remains the same, and the less vulnerability I have, and if I can reduce that through development measures. And this is where it's very important. I would like to bring a point later in using the same principle here. I'd like to quote a Latin word called metis, and it's from James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. Sorry, it's actually Greek, pardon me. So in the book, it looks at the practical knowledge and experience gained from experience being praxis. So he defines metis as a wide array of practical skills and acquired intelligence in responding to a constantly changing natural and human environment. I repeat, a wide array of practical skills and acquired intelligence in responding to a constantly changing natural and human environment. So many people call this indigenous knowledge or local knowledge. This is really important because local people have acquired an intelligence and a skill, which as disaster experts and disaster managers, sometimes we very often fail to recognize, to build on what is already there. Local knowledge, and I'll give you a few examples to illustrate that. Here are the two important elements. First is it's practical, it can be used. And first is environment. Where am I located? What are my local conditions? And the additional element is what skills and knowledge do I have that can only be learned through practice, not just some intellectual understanding of it. Further, it actually involves something that is very local and very specific. So in research and as disaster management trainers, we really need to ask the community, what do they have locally as skills and knowledge? Because community, as I said, are first responders. What skills and knowledge do they have? What common local material and assets that they have that can be used? For example, drinking water containers. I'm sure in the Northeast or in Mizoram, in rural areas, you can easily use bamboo. In Japan, for example, where I've worked, people use paper cups and they make, the Japanese are very good with making things from paper. So they make plates from paper, they fold it, it's called origami. You can fold and make papers, toys, cups, even spoons. For example, life jackets, and I'll show you some examples of life jackets. What are the how can they make and use tools for rescue, such as stretchers to actually move people, very important in an earthquake. For example, blankets, lungi in Tamil Nadu and in Myanmar, puang in Mizoram and many parts of the Northeast. What can they use as ropes, for example? If they don't have ropes, what is the immediate way you can find something to rope? Because it's very important in floods and landslides, even in earthquakes, to look at ropes to pull material out or pull people out. For example, in the West, they use car covers because you cover your car and that can be used to actually drag or lift someone to an ambulance from the debris. But what would that be in another country or in your local area? Because not everybody has cars in rural areas, for example. So that is where for example, in J&K or even in Mizoram, you have blankets and many people store blankets because in winter it can get very cold. So blankets are used as a stretcher to actually rescue people from the site or travel distances into a local PHC or a hospital. In Bangladesh, in Tamil Nadu, it's the lungi. Myanmar, sarong and lungi. Thailand, sarong. In Mizoram, in your local areas, you'll have multiple things. So for the same function, locally, I can innovate and create more different opportunities for my rescue tools. But it's important for a disaster management manager or a disaster expert who comes there to bring global practice, but also to ask this locally. And those are the social dimensions and the local capacity questions we need to ask in terms of DRR. For example, this is an earthquake location, and this is in Japan. People use car jacks, but in Japan, car jacks are powered by the car, and it is usually not the conventional car jacks that we use, which is hydraulic here. It's actually either with air or it's electronic or hydraulic using the car battery. But in Indonesia, it is not like that. In Indonesia, it is just the same like in India. So you can use car jacks to actually lift debris. So this is a site. But even in Japan, in remote locations, the car might be completely destroyed, or the car might be, you cannot inflate this airbag. You'll have to do it either manually, or you will have to actually do it with an actual conventional car jack. For example, life jackets can be made out of plastic bottles. And this is what is called globalization. This is global best practice now taken to different places. So this particular thing of making canoes, or even using tires in floods, or using plastic bottles and then tying it with a rope around you as local practice. And this is what is really locally available and communities can use. And this is based on asking communities, how did you survive? And it's based on actually asking, researching the right question to build on already what's working. So let me look at invisible aspects of these things, which is also an important social dimension. And I'll give you a few examples from my experience. During the 2015 floods in Tamil Nadu, it was not just that the cyclone destroyed houses. There were farms that were flooded. There are people who work on those farms who are landless labor. But conventionally, government relief only looks at destruction of property in terms of housing. So when a farm is flooded, and the first important thing that NGOs and the government looks at what is destroyed, property, rescuing people from their thing. So somebody's house may not be destroyed, but their farm might be destroyed. So these are some of the invisible, or the government and NGOs take some time to reach these people. So it's important to ask these questions. For example, during tsunami and earthquakes, very often we only give compensation to the owners of the buildings. What about people who are living in as tenants and have destroyed whatever it is, their material things that they have, which may not be insured, TVs, other assets in the house. So during COVID, for example, it took a long time for government and NGOs to realize the crisis of migrant labor, and they do not have actually access to rations. First of all, their income is stopped. They're not earning anymore as daily wage laborers. So how will they survive with food? So it took a long time. The first immediate thing was about healthcare, and everything was about access to health, number of beds during the COVID and the other aspects of lockdown. But post-lockdown, this became an issue. So it's important to look at what are the other aspects of social dimensions that we really need to think of. So the experts really need to ask both global best practices, but also ask survivors and ask the community what assets and skills you have. And if you have this problem, how will you respond? So if you have a flood and you don't have utensils, how would you make a cup or a plate, or how would you actually look at different local materials for that particular purpose? So survivor stories and practices are important. In fact, it's based on a social skill, a social science dimension called appreciative inquiry. I talked about globalization. It's not either or. It's not only global experts, and it's not only local indigenous knowledge. We can learn from each other. And that's where countries cooperating, or different regions in a country cooperating, is very important. And best is building local capacity. And one important point is that from my experience, we do not sustain the local capacity and skills and preparedness during non-disaster time. Well, what do I mean by that? During the 2015 floods, it was in the same location that was hit by the tsunami in 2004. And there was so much money that had come in, there was so much preparedness and efforts that had gone in, and we really do not look at there was a gap. In 2010, mostly all recovery processes had been done. People were relocated and rehabilitated in their this thing for the tsunami recovery. But in the 2015 floods came, I would say that they could have been given the amount of training that community had, they could have done better. But what happened was the training has to be sustained during non-disaster time. Just because a disaster is not happening, the skills I learned, first aid, or even evacuation drills, are very important. So drills are very important during non-disaster time. And why I'll tell you this, because we have the crisis management phase, and many of you would have faced this. You have, and you have the risk management, which is prediction, preparedness, mitigation, and prevention. It's during this time above here that we really need to do drills and have the community and the government prepared. During this time, we will all respond, yes. And during when we are recovering and doing rehabilitation and reconstruction, we will train people and we will have the government system being trained. But when after everything is over, we really need to be better prepared and continue with these drills. That is really building resilience. And that's why I said we need to integrate even development dimensions in disaster management. Let me then take you to a landmark decision in 2005 when we had something called the Hugo framework. And this is the first time that we actually had that different agencies and different, we really required coordination to intervene in disasters for recovery. And if you want to really, there are different actors, and how can different actors actually play a real role in disaster losses? So disaster risk reduction was a priority. And I think the key thing was strengthening preparedness for response. So these were the 5 priorities. And these are major shifts in disaster management that has happened globally. And India is a signatory to it. And we have been integrating this local in different state governments and their disaster management authorities. The second one was the Sendai framework. It looked at substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses, livelihoods, health, and economic and physical, social, and cultural environmental assets of person, business, communities, and countries. So it broadened the number of stakeholders of looking at it, both from physical, social, cultural, and environmental, including business, actually. So it was a new framework. It's still 2013, but it called for a newer understanding of disaster risk, strengthening governance, disaster risk governance to manage it. It talked about building resilience by investing in disaster risk reduction. Now, it also talked about build back better. That means what was there, how we recover should be better than how it was before, whether it was social, whether it is economic, whether it is other development infrastructure that exists in those locations. And lastly, in 2015, we have something called the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals. And for the first time, there's a consensus with business and in government that we have goals that have environment, which includes climate change and disasters, social, and economic and development aspects of human development. So it's an integrated view of looking at human development and disaster management. Now, earlier environment was always discussed separately in Rio or in different conventions. And the social dimensions of poverty was dealt with, different conventions and conferences dealing with human development. And economic and development aspects were dealt with places like Davos. Now, for the first time, we actually have all of them coming together as one framework. So when we actually have to integrate all of them, how do we build resilience? Integrating preparedness in all aspects of development, and that is the challenge. So that means we need to work cross-sectorally. We need to work with different disciplines. And it's intersectional work of dealing with many dimensions of social norms. In a community, we might have issues of gender, caste, religion, multiple divisions that we have. It's not only entering through one, we have to build back better and build a better society. So integrating the development process with preparedness, risk reduction, and building back better in rehabilitation. So conventionally, and I'd like to share a frame, and this is how we've had responses in any sector, in fact, not only disaster management and disaster recovery, that we intervene with technical solutions, solve a problem, and it's like Band-Aid. We are not asking the problems of issues that were the socioeconomic questions that were there before the disaster. So it's important to actually, if you want to build back better, we need to look at systemic problems that created the problem, the inequities in the first place. For example, in migrant labor, they didn't have a ration card system where they could get their ration everywhere. That question existed before COVID. So how do we build back better and respond better, where we're not only giving relief and measures, relief and food to migrant labor, but we're creating systems such that if there's another pandemic, and this is not the first pandemic, there will be many more, how do we look at dealing with the same issue differently and to build better resilience in our response measures, not only as Band-Aid and patchwork of distributing relief. So one nation, one ration card is one example of how the system can be. So we really need to look at system and cultural norms that causes vulnerability. In this case, I'm giving the example of the pandemic because it's fresh in our minds. And it's not just that we need to, so it's not, I'm not saying don't give relief, but also address systemic issues. There's also another dimension where we talk about building capacity of communities, that we really need to build capacity and leadership in communities so that we can build them to be more whole and more resilient. And we do that as a separate training program. So I want to show you this frame, and this frame is available with, it's a book by Dr. Monica Sharma, and it talks about how I can look at all three. And many times that we only look at immediate causes and we do not forget about it beyond the relief, we really need to look at building it more whole. So how do I do all three simultaneously? And that's a design frame that she has created, where in any disaster, I can look at all three and build back better. In fact, it's a development model, actually, not necessarily linked to disaster management. It can be applied in any subject. The book reference is down. And I want to also highlight one more point where we actually, in our response measures, we always look at disaster response and relief. The strategies for survival, the strategies to reduce poverty, the strategies to stop violence, the strategies for just, disasters is only responding to a problem. It does not realize the full potential of government or people to really look at prosperity and equity. We need to do both. And often in disaster management and interventions, we just focus on this particular thing of responding to the problems. So we are not really building the system back better or the society back better. So how do we do both? And let me show you how it can actually come together. So I can have technical solutions relief. I can also look at systemic problems in the recovery process, and I can build capacity of local people all together simultaneously in time. So I just want to leave this with you, that this is a frame of a development model and approach that we can actually use in disaster management or as a development model to actually build back better. So the 5 takeaways I'd like to end with. One, that risk can be reduced by social dimensions and development dimensions, because I can then reduce my vulnerability. I can build capacity of local people and the government to deal better with disasters and disaster management, to make a disaster to only make it a hazard and not really a disaster. Second takeaway is it's important to have capacity during non-disaster time. The third, it's important to have localization of different best practices from the global thing, but also to build on what is already how people survive and what local skills and assets they have to respond to a disaster. The fourth element is to look at invisible aspects of a disaster, whom gets left out or something that we do not see. And the lastly, which I just shared with you, what are the new ways of building back and designing interventions to be more holistic and to build back better? So I'd like to leave these 5 takeaways with you, and thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you what I have learned over my experience of the last 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, for your enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. And I believe that those informations and knowledge on disaster management will be helpful for all the viewers in this time of panic in the area. And regarding the certificates of participation, the download link will be sent to your email, and only those who have submitted the daily feedback form will receive their certificates. With that, we have come to the end of the technical sessions of international webinar. I hope that each and every participant will benefit from the webinar. On a final note, as an assistant coordinator of the IQSC Government Sampaio College, I would like to render few notes of thanks on behalf of Government Sampaio College. First and foremost, I thank the Almighty God for the success of this webinar. Secondly, I would like to thank the Principal of Government Sampaio College for his continued support, and the staff of the college for their invaluable contributions, and also the coordinators, RUSA, Government Sampaio College, for arranging the sponsorship for this webinar. I sincerely thank all the resource persons for their hard work and dedication for providing information, quality information to make this webinar an accomplishment. I also thank the organizing committee for having the vision to organize the webinar, which will no doubt help especially victims of recent earthquakes. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants and YouTube viewers who validated the hard work and effort put into this webinar by the organizers, resource persons, and the faculty members of Government Sampaya College. Even though I have nothing but gratefulness for everything, I apologize certain elements which cannot be helped, like technical inconsistencies and the medium of delivery, as it is necessary to ensure that the intended audience would be educated, comforted, and be made aware of nature of earthquake and the current tremors that have been felt in the area. As all good things must come to an end, so does this webinar. Thank you everyone for your contribution to make this webinar a resounding success. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam.